Hello everyone, welcome to Edukemy's YouTube channel. I'm Nanki Baveja, faculty for economy at Edukemy. This video is a part of the video series where we are discussing summary of each and every chapter of the economic survey that has been recently tabled in the parliament. Now, if you wish to see more such videos, then please hit the bell icon so that a notification pops up the moment Edukemy puts up a new video. Coming back to the chapter 2 summary, what we will be discussing in this video is the fiscal developments. Fiscal developments that have taken place in the last 1 year in the economy. If you have watched my previous video where I was discussing the chapter 1's summary, वहाँ पे क्या था? Chapter 1 talked about the macroeconomic parameters in a broader way. They didn't deep dive into the picture. They didn't provide you the details of it. Just a broad overview was given in the chapter 1. And in the end, strategy, which is called the Babel strategy, was provided for, which the government adopted to deal with the pandemic. But chapter 2 onwards, we will be picking up each and every macroeconomic parameter and discussing it in detail, or let's say we will deep dive into each and every macroeconomic parameter. In chapter 2, the parameter that we'll discuss or we'll talk about is the fiscal developments that have taken place. Now you know that there are two policies in any country. One is fiscal policy and the other one is monetary policy, and both have a very crucial role in saving the economy whenever any contingency hits or wherever there is a situation of crisis. Both have an equivalent role to play. But what we will discuss today is the developments in the fiscal policy. Hence, we will be talking about the fiscal developments. So, the agenda for the today's discussion is we will start with talking about the policy strategy. Then we will see the trends. We will see in the trends in the major parameters, and in the last we will talk about the policy adopted for effective government spending. Effective government spending that was adopted. So without wasting time, let's now start with taking up the first parameter, which is the performance of fiscal indicators. And the first one that we will be taking is the level of fiscal deficit and the primary deficit of the country. Now, what do you think or what do you hope for has been the level of fiscal deficit or primary deficit in the country in last 1 year? So, for your information, the graph is placed and it shows that the level of fiscal deficit has fallen if compared to the year 2020. So this is the figure for 2020, and now in 2021 the fiscal deficit as well as the primary deficit has fallen. The reason for increase in fiscal deficit here, fiscal deficit क्यों increase हुआ था 2020 में when the first lockdown was imposed? Because at that time the revenues had a dip, and at the same time government spending or the spending by the government shot up because the government had to spend a lot on the health infrastructure and managing the crisis in the country. So that was the reason that the fiscal deficit here shows this picture, because the revenues or the sources of revenue for the government was limited, as well as the spending avenues for the government increased during the 2020, but now it is well in control, so that you can see that it has fallen even below the pre-pandemic times. So it was 8.1 lakh crore before the pandemic. That was the year 2019 and 20. This is the figure at which the fiscal deficit was standing, and now if you see, it is reduced. It has reduced, and thanks to the policies and strategies adopted by the government of India, that the fiscal deficit has fallen, and so is the primary deficit. Next in line is the trends in major direct and indirect taxes. So this is giving you again a broad overview as to whether the direct taxes or indirect taxes collection has increased over time or not. Now, if you see, if you take each and every tax, be it corporate tax, be it income tax, this forms the direct tax group. And indirect taxes में क्या आता है? Customs आते हैं. There is excise duty, there is GST. And what trend do you see? देखिए, there is an increase in each of it. There was certainly a fall, there was certainly a dip during 2020 when there was first nationwide lockdown was imposed in the country. There was disruption in the economic activity. There was restrictions imposed on the movement of people. Consumption of services actually saw a dip, and hence you can see the impact. There were no demand for imports in the country, right? So you can see a dip in the customs, right? Now, what led to the improvement in the collection of each and every tax? So for, say, corporate tax, the reforms that were taken, in the corporate tax, there was a reduction in the tax duty that was announced in the year 2019. Due to which initially there was a fall that was witnessed in collection of corporate tax, but eventually it also matched up, or in fact it surpassed the level which is the pre-pandemic level, that is in the year 2019. If you see the income tax also, the redressal mechanism, the speedier settlement of disputes all led to the increase in the collection of income tax. The reason that the custom collection also went up is, first, initially when there was no demand during the first lockdown, it fell. But with the revival of economic activity and the domestic demand in the country, the custom collection. So revival of domestic demand could be the reason. For increase in the customs. Then increase in excise duty, the reason could be attributed to increase in the excise duties levied on fuel. So the government increased the taxes or the excise duty on fuels, and hence there was increase in the collection of union excise duties. And last is the GST collection, which also went up, and the reason is the nationwide drive to track the GST evaders and to collect tax from them. So there was a nationwide drive against the GST evaders. So friends, while you are reading these graphs, आपको ये याद नहीं रखना है कि कौन सा जो टैक्स है, कौन सा कितना कलेक्शन कितने परसेंट से पड़ा. You don't have to mug up these from the exams point of view. All you need to know is that the collection of every tax, be it the direct tax or the indirect tax, went up. That is all you need to know. Not that the minute details ki kaun sa kitne percent se increase hua. So you need to know the broader picture. So the next slide also talks about the collection in the major direct and indirect taxes, and it also shows you the trend that you don't just need to remember for your exams. This is just for your easier understanding that I am discussing it here. So if you see the collection in the corporate tax, so it has grown by 90% when compared with the period in April to November 2020. So this mentions collection in April to November 2021, and if you see, the collection in corporate tax has shooted up by 90%, and so is with the case of income tax. The collection has increased by 47.2% if compared to the previous year, the same term, April to November 2020, and so is the major trends can be seen in customs, union excise duty, and the gross GST collection. All of it has increased except the union excise duty. Next, the trends in fiscal deficit. What we will now take up is we will deep dive into each of the parameter and study or talk about it in detail. So the first one is the trends in deficit level. What is the trend that have been seen in the past few years? So this actually forms और holds importance for your prelims exams, क्योंकि prelims में अक्सर 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 trends related question पूछे जाते हैं that there could be a statement that could be provided that the fiscal deficit has been constantly increasing from last 5 years, or it has been constantly declining, or it has been maintained by the government. So you need to know what is the trend in the deficit level and the other various economic parameters. So if you talk about the trends in fiscal deficit, so what is provided is as a result of the shortfall in revenue, क्या हुआ था, revenue collection नीचे, and additional expenditure requirements to mitigate the fallout. So that is what I told you. In 2020, what happened when there was first lockdown? Revenue actually fell suddenly and there was expenditure that got increased. Now when an expenditure increases or surpasses the revenue, what happens is the situation of deficit, and so is the case with the Indian economy. That is the thing that happened here, that with the shortfall of revenue collection and the additional expenditure which the government had to undertake to mitigate the pandemic, the fiscal deficit was revised from 3.5% to 9.5%. आइए देखते हैं. Look at this. So fiscal deficit is denoted by this color. I'll change the color of pen for your convenience. So this is the fiscal deficit. देखिए, look at the trend of it. It was managed. It was constant or stable, you can say, in the last 4, 5 or 3 years. But with the onset of pandemic in the country, क्या हुआ? It was on the verge of rise in 2019. बढ़ रहा था, but it went to 9.2 in the 2020. And that is what you need to remember from your prelims point of view, that the deficit is no longer stable. That is a fiscal deficit we are talking about. अब stable नहीं है, पहले stable था last 4 years में, but with 2019 it started increasing and it got increased to the level of 9.2 in the year 2021. But now with the again the revival of the domestic activities or the economic activities in the country and the domestic demand and with the collection of revenue and better management of expenditure, it is again falling. So in 2021-22, so you can see a fall in the fiscal deficit level. Next is the fiscal deficit for provisional actuals stood at 9.2% of the GDP. So what you need to know, if you don't remember the exact figure, so just remember the trend. That is what we studied here, and so we'll go for the primary deficit also. जब fiscal deficit बढ़ा तो primary deficit क्या कर रहा था? Primary deficit के लिए I will change the color of the pen first. So for the fiscal deficit, this is the trend. For primary deficit, this is the line, and you see this was again stable, constant, managed, but started increasing with the year 2019 and 20 and 2021 May. It also rose to the level of 5.8%, but now it is falling. So if a question comes for fiscal deficit or the primary deficit, you should be in a position to answer, because now you are updated with the trends in these two parameters. Next in line we have trends in receipts. So government की receipts कितने type की होती है? So basically you can actually categorize the government receipts into two parts. The one is the debt creating, the other one is non-debt creating. Debt creating मतलब जो government के लिए liability create करती है, and non-debt creating are the one which do not create any liability for the government. So debt creation वाली क्या हो गई? Government ने अगर borrow किया है, it is causing change in the asset and liability position of the government, and non-debt creating one is the one which do not change the asset and liability position of the government, right? So that do not create debt. So this is the way, that is the major way in which the receipts of the government can be bifurcated. Now when we talk about the non-debt creating, that again can be classified into two. So the tax ones, the tax revenue and the non-tax revenue. नॉन डेट क्रिएटिंग रिसीट्स जो होती हैं उसको हम फिर से डिवाइड कर सकते हैं, एक रेवेन्यू जो टैक्स कलेक्शन से हुआ है एंड द अदर काइंड ऑफ रेवेन्यू विच इज अदर देन द टैक्स कलेक्शन, लाइक गवर्नमेंट को इंटरेस्ट एक्रू हुआ है ऑन द इन्वेस्टमेंट दैट इट हैज मेड, द प्रॉफिट्स दैट द पब्लिक सेक्टर अंडरटेकिंग्स ट्रांसफर टू द गवर्नमेंट, ये सब क्या है, इट इज नॉन टैक्स रेवेन्यू फॉर द गवर्नमेंट. भाई इनकम ही है ना गवर्नमेंट के, राइट? So, but it is not from the tax sources, it is from the non-tax sources. So, it will come under this category. So, this graph or this pie chart actually shows you the composition of taxes in the gross tax revenue. Which tax contributed most to the government's exchequer or to the treasury? So, it is the corporate tax. It is the corporation tax that is denoted by this blue color, and if you see income tax, which means that direct tax, you see contributed this much, around 50%, and the rest 50% came by the collection of GST, custom and union excise duty. And let's wait for the actual figures to come, but till almost equal contribution by the direct tax and the indirect tax, as we can see from this pie chart. Next in line is taxes as the percentage of the GDP. So tax collection to the government has fallen, and majorly on account of direct taxes, particularly corporate tax. तो corporate tax क्यों गिर गया भाई, ऐसा क्या हो गया that there is fall in the collection of direct tax? Now you can see it is 3.5% of the GDP. Till 2018-19, how much the corporate tax was contributing to the government's kitty is 3.5% of the GDP. But in 2019-20, what happened was there was a tax cut that was announced on the corporate tax that led to the fall in the collection of corporate tax. Hence, the corporate tax contributed less to the government's bank or the government's pool or the government's kitty, किसी भी नाम से बुलाइए, but आपको ये याद रखना है that there was fall in the corporate tax collection, and on the account of corporate tax cut that was announced in 2019 and 20. Okay. Now if you see further in 2020-21, there was a further reduction. Pehle bhai 3.5% of GDP corporate tax was contributing, then it fell to 2.7 ka level, and then even further it got reduced to 2.3% of the GDP that the corporate tax was contributing. Now if you see the trends in the collection of other taxes, if you see the GST also witnessed a dip because of the fall in the economic activity in the country. There were lockdowns that was imposed, so the contribution to the GDP of the GST also took a toll. But one major trend that you need to know is the collection of corporate tax that we have discussed, and you know the reason behind it. Next that we need to discuss, another thing is the collection of revenue for the government from non-tax sources. हमने यहाँ बात करी थी ना, we talked about that there are two ways in which the receipts of the government can be bifurcated. The first one क्या है, there is debt creating, which creates debt for the government, and the other one is non-debt creating. Non-debt creating maybe we can bifurcate into two parts. The first one is the tax one, and the other one is the non-tax revenue. Okay. Now we have talked about the collection from the tax sources. Now what we will discuss is non-tax revenue. So from the non-tax revenue, कौन से हुए non-tax revenue? Interest receipts. Central government loan देती है state government को, right? It doesn't give them interest-free loan. It earns an interest on the loan extended to the state government. So that is the interest receipts. Dividends and profits of PSUs that I talked about. The grants that the government received from the foreign countries to cope up with the economic situation. All of this forms non-tax revenue for the government, and it comes under non-debt creating receipts. Non-debt creating receipts because it do not change the asset and liability position of the government, right? Basics की समझ होनी बहुत 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 ज़्यादा crucial है in order to understand these graphs. Now let's look at the trend. Let's look at the trend that क्या है non-tax revenue का, whether it is increasing or it is increasing. So non-tax revenue actually increased for the year 2021-22 by 16%. But here you can see there was a fall that was there. Earlier it was 3.27, right? But then it fall to 2.08 lakhs crore. But in the last year, you could see an increase by 16%. 2.43, 2.08 ka 16% hota hai. So the increase is by the 16% in the non-tax revenue collection of the government. Now let's move on to the another trend. Another important parameter that you need to know, trends in expenditure. Trends in expenditure is very important, तो थोड़ा सा इस पे attention देंगे हम. So the two types of expenditure by the government, revenue expenditure और दूसरा होता है, the other one is capital expenditure. That leads to creation of assets for the government, which could in future generate revenue for the government or returns for the government. So ये हो गए two types of expenditure, and the revenue expenditure is what? Expenditure for day-to-day running. Right? Now if you see the trend, so we'll start with the revenue expenditure first. So these are the years that are mentioned. I will actually zoom this out for your clear view. Now if you see, this is the revenue expenditure, this dotted line. If you see, during the year 2019-20, 2021, it actually went up because the government had to make immediate expenses to manage the situation. So expenditure on the account of revenue expenditure increased during the onset of pandemic. But with the time, and you see at that very time, the capital expenditure actually witnessed a downfall. So this is the capital expenditure. So if you see during 2019 and 20, there is a dip that can be seen in the capital expenditure. So that time during the onset of pandemic, the government actually focused more on revenue expenditure and later thought of improving the quality of expenditure so that it can create assets for the government and which in future can generate revenue or returns for the government. So with time, actually government focused on improving the quality of the expenditure by investing more in the infrastructure development, which we would categorize as the capital expenditure. So this is the trend that you need to know about in expenditure, where we talked about the revenue and the capital expenditure. Now the transfer to states. Now this is also an expenditure to the government, that is the central government, that the transfer to the states have to be made every year from the central government's pool. So the central governments or the central government actually accepted the recommendation of the 15th Finance Commission, recommendation of 15th Finance Commission for grants to the states by the central government was accepted by the central government, and the grants were made in tandem with what 15th Finance Commission provided for. Next in line, we have the central government's debt composition. What constitutes the central government debt? So let's move on to the basics again. Central government debt includes the debt against the Consolidated Fund of India. Debt against the Consolidated Fund of India plus the liabilities into the public account constitutes the central government debt. इन दोनों को मिला के बनता है central government debt, and hence this is for your better retention. And if you see the composition of the central government debt, किसका ज़्यादा composition था, which contributed more, whether it is the public debt or the liabilities on the account of liabilities in the public account, which contributed more. This is again one such figure. This is again one such figure that you need to remember when we talk about the exam. So if you see the public debt, which is denoted by this blue color, constitutes almost 90% of the central government's debt composition, and the rest 10% is the liabilities taken on the account of or contracted against the public account. So that constitutes or just hold the 10%. Rest 90% is formed by the debt which the government has taken against the consolidated fund of India. So this is the broader composition of the central government's debt. Next in line, what we have is, we have the trend, the overall trend as to how did the debt to GDP ratio of the center behaved in the last few years. So total liabilities of the government has sharply risen in the 2021 on account of the expenditure that the government has to do, and the expenditure was funded or was done with the help of the higher borrowing. The government had to resort to borrowing to fund its expenses, and hence the liabilities of the government increased in the year 2021, and we will see it with this graph. So again, an important figure that you need to remember. So we will see what is the trend in the central government's debt to GDP ratio. So if you see here, it is telling, or it from the year 2004 and 5. So us time the debt to GDP ratio of the central government was somewhere around 62% here, right? But it fell sharply in year 2005 and 6, and then no constant pattern can be observed till the year 2010-11. From 2011-12 onwards, you can see it is stable. From 2011-12 to the year 15 and 16, it is well managed, it is stable. Then again, it fell, again managed. You see how beautiful it is. It was managed from this time, again from this time. But with onset of pandemic, in the last quarter of the financial year 2019-20, and in the financial year 2021, when the first lockdown was imposed in the March, look at the level. Look at the debt to GDP ratio of the central government, and the reason is increased in expenditure, and the increase in expenditure by the government was funded by the borrowings that the government have taken, and with the increase in borrowing, the liability got increased, and hence is the government's debt, or we can say government debt to GDP ratio. Now you see how there is connection of various parameters in the economy. Nothing can operate in silos when we talk about the Indian economy or any economy in the world. Everything is interlinked when we talk about the economy as a whole subject. Moving on to the state government's finances. Now state government, since now the central government's budget took a toll, or the expenditure took a toll, or the debt level took a toll, state government kaise bach sakti hai? In fact, when we talk about the state government finances, it also crossed the threshold prescribed under the FRBM Act. FRBM prescribes the level of debt for the state government of their gross state domestic product. And in the recent years, state government's debt to GDP ratio has actually crossed the threshold. It has crossed the threshold as prescribed by the FRBM Act. And one of the major reason again contributing to it is the increase in the revenue expenditure, and that leading to increase in the revenue deficit. So revenue deficit of the state also increased from 0.1% of the GDP in 2018-19 to 2% of the GDP in 2020. But first we will see the gross fiscal deficit of these states. So where is it? So this is the gross fiscal deficit. So in the percentage of GDP, we'll talk about it for the year 2019-20, 2021 and 21-22. So in 1920, it was somewhere around 2.6% of the GDP. But it went till 31%, it went till 4.6% of the GDP, and then it again contracted to 3.7% of the GDP. Remember, these blue bars actually shows the gross fiscal deficit of the government in the percent of GDP, and it increased. It was managed somehow, but with the onset of pandemic, it also increased. The way the central government's debt to GDP ratio also took a toll, and the revenue deficit also increased. All of it surpassed the limits prescribed under the FRBM Act. Chalte hain next. Overall, let's see the overall picture of the general government finances. क्या दिया हुआ है इसमें? So if we talk about the gross fiscal deficit, the gross fiscal deficit is this. So if you talk about the gross fiscal deficit, it got increased. This is the trend. But with 21-22, the policies adopted by the government of India, the fiscal policy, and thanks to the monetary policy that actually contributed or managed the money supply in the country, all of this is now contracting. Be it the fiscal deficit, be it the revenue deficit, all of it are falling with time, which got increased here. And you see, this is fiscal deficit, this is revenue deficit. So they are falling with time. Last in line, we have the policy measures which the government took, the new initiatives that the government took to enhance the government spending, enhance the efficiency of the government spending. भाई अगर गवर्नमेंट 10 रुपए खर्च कर रही है तो उसका इम्पैक्ट 100 रुपए का होना चाहिए और से 50 रुपए का होना चाहिए. सो दैट इज व्हाट इज एनहांसिंग द एफिशिएंसी. इट शुड प्रोवाइड बेनिफिट टू द मैक्सिमम नंबर ऑफ पीपल, or we can say it should help the government save more money, which can be actually used for the welfare spending later. So the two things that the government did to enhance the efficiency of government spending is, first is the extensive use of the GEM portal, that is the government e-marketplace, for procurement of various items for the government. And it is not just limited to procuring stationery, pen and cooler for the government, but also tenders for the projects, social projects, social infrastructure, health infrastructure, all of it. For the acquisition of all of it, the government e-marketplace, that is the GEM portal, was used, and it is provided in the economic survey that it actually led to the fall in the expenditure level or fall in the cost for the government with the usage of this portal. The next thing the government did is the reforms that it brought in the public procurement and the project management. So it says that one size fits all approach should be abandoned. Every project that the government thinks to undertake, there should be a new way to evaluate, new way to procure. Things for that project should be devised. So increasing the efficiency just does not involve restructuring the expenditure, but it also involves enhancing the efficiency of expenditure. By expenditure ko restructure karke ki bhai, earlier we were spending more on revenue side and now we should spend more on the capital side. This is just the one part of it. In order to have the complete benefit of increasing the efficiency, you have to enhance the efficiency of the, or if you want to reap more benefits of the expenditure, out of the expenditure that the government does in the economy, you have to enhance the efficiency and not just restructure the expenditure structure. And for that, two measures that are taken is the GEM and the reforms in the public procurement management. So this is all that was provided in the summary of the chapter 2. So with this, I'll come to the end of the chapter 2 summary. Next in line is we will discuss the chapter 3 summary, where we will be talking or throwing light on the external sector of the country. How did these parameters perform in last 1 year? Till then, please stay tuned and hit the bell icon so that you don't miss out on the notifications on the new videos that the Edukemy comes up with. Till that time, have a good day and all the best for your preparation.